The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to Liberty Mail. This is Libby Krieger.
And I'm Aaron Jenks.
And we're coming to you from the underground studio here at Grove City College. Thank you so much for listening, and we have a lot to give you today. So starting off, we have the oral arguments that happened Wednesday at the Supreme Court for the Dobbs versus Jackson Whole Women's Health. And that is the case that could possibly overturn Roe versus Wade. So I know Aaron and I have a lot of exciting things, a lot of interesting analysis to give you on that. First of all, I was actually there outside of the Supreme Court protesting with a group of pro-life students here from Grove City College, Young Women for America. We went and there were a bunch of pro-life protesters as well. I'd say we definitely outnumbered the pro-choicers too. So that was really encouraging. Just setting the scene, there was such a dichotomy between the pro-life side and the pro-choice side where you had the pro-life side, really, they were praying together, and we were all really happy. Everyone had smiles on their faces, excited to be there. And then the pro-choice side was very bitter and angry. It was much smaller, but a lot of yelling. And there were even a group of women who were taking they were taking abortion pills on the spot there. And so it was just kind of more disturbing to see. And the things that you were hearing from that side too, you had women screaming about, "Oh, my abortion saved my life," which is absurd in itself. In the own sentence, it kind of contradicts saving your life with an abortion. So I guess just setting the scene, though, it was really encouraging to see how much the pro-life side outnumbered the pro-choice side. Mm-hmm.
I definitely thought that the most encouraging part was that you had all of these, whether it's progressives or secularists, whatever they want to call themselves, atheists, and they all have signs there. Mm-hmm. So it's not just all these religious people coming to these protests and arguing the pro-life
side, yeah.
Sorry. And so to see that movement, and we talked about this on like the second or third podcast where there's a new progressive movement of secularists and atheists coming together to argue the pro-life movement.
Yeah, and I believe I saw the speaker or the leader of that group that we talked about. I think it's called the Progressive Anti-Abortion Activist or something of that sort. It's like POW.
I think her name's Kristen too.
Yeah, or something Bukovic, or Teresa Bukovic, I think. And she spoke, and there were several other speakers who were like, I am an atheist, but I'm pro-life. And so it really tackled the narrative that I think the left often propagates of the pro-life side being white old men who want to oppress women by not allowing them to live freely and kill their children. Because you were seeing so many women there. Women definitely outnumbered the men, too, on the pro-life side. And you were seeing people of every race as well, every age. And so that was also so encouraging to see. This is not as much of a political aisle side issue where you have the right and the left, but this is truly a human rights issue. And so it's like a single issue where we're bringing in so many people from every side. It's so encouraging. And I think that has happened mostly in recent years. I think there's been a shift from as much left and right on this issue, but just those who value human life from the beginning. Yeah,
definitely in the recent years, the dominant voice have been women on the pro-life side. And then I was listening this past couple of days to this podcast by, her name is Catherine Colbert, and she argued the Casey Planned Parenthood. She was the lawyer in that case in front of the Supreme Court in 1992.
And she was on the pro-choice side, correct?
No, she's pro-choice, sorry.
Okay.
And she recently wrote a book called Controlling Women, What We Must Do to Save Our Reproductive Freedom. And so, excuse me, but in this podcast, she's chalking up the pro-life movement to be full of men. And okay, coming from like that kind of narrative of full of men, misogyny, kind of expect that in the general media, but someone at the forefront of the pro-choice movement, I feel like would be a little more maybe educated or at least open to, okay, we can understand the other points of view because we need to maybe change their point of view, so we have to understand it. But no, she chalked up the pro-life movement to be completely full of misogyny and motivated by just the will to control women's bodies and control their families, she argued, which was just so out of touch, I thought. And it was really surprising to see that.
Definitely. And I know you have a lot more analysis on her podcast itself, right? But another thing to note that I especially noticed while at the Supreme Court and listening to what the other side was saying is how it's such a selfish argument. You have these pro-choicers saying, I have this right to kill my child, and my body, my choice. It's all about my life will be ruined. And just to hear the argument saying, as women, we cannot be equal to men in society if we don't have the right to kill our children. That is blatantly absurd, and I just cannot understand how someone could legitimately see that as a good argument for the pro-choice side.
Mm-hmm. I think it boils down to having the freedom of what you want to do, and I kind of got this just from listening to whether any of my friends back home or listening to the podcast recently, that pro-choice kind of proponents, it's all about the individual and that freedom. So at the end of the day, if this woman cannot control what she wants to do with her life, because like say when or not she wants a baby, then the government is being restrictive on her body or restrictive on her personal life, and that's an overreach. Yeah. And that's kind of their viewpoint comes down to it. But when I time and time and again, when you ask, okay, where do you get these rights? Like, what rights do you possess? And they're like, okay, so me as my personal individual, the state's giving us these rights. And I've heard this time and time and again, and this is such like a cliff between what conservatives believe where we get our rights and our freedoms, which is natural law or derived from God, God-given rights. But then time and again, I listen to these speakers that are pro-choice, and they're stating that, okay, no, the state and the government is giving us our rights, and so that's why they see a case like this, and they're petrified because they're like, the government's overreaching, or they're going to take away our right. It's a really weird split between ideologies of where you get your rights, or like what establishes a right in this country. And
like the difference in worldview, you can see kind of coming into play there. And just kind of going over the oral arguments. So that was about like 1 hour, 45 minutes. I listened to that on the way back from DC. But first, I'll give you some context of what other conservatives felt about the arguments. Rachel Bavard, who's actually a Grove City grad, she now works for Conservative Partnership Institute. She said on Twitter, finally listening to the Dobbs argument, and holy cow, Alito got Biden's Solicitor General to defend the 60 years of Plessy versus Ferguson, which imposed state-sanctioned racial segregation because it was established precedent. And then Michael Knowles said, finally listening to the oral arguments, I'm no legal scholar, but the pro-abortion lawyer lady's performance seems surprisingly weak. So both of those kind of showing you that conservatives are feeling pretty good about how the arguments went. I think the biggest points that were discussed in the arguments were stare decisis, which is precedent, and that goes to Rachel's point about Plessy versus Ferguson, is saying just because it's established precedent doesn't mean it's correct. If the original ruling, so we're saying in this case Roe, was unconstitutional, there was no grounding for a right to privacy, they kind of just made it up out of the 14th Amendment due process clause. If that was wrong, then everything from it, just because years and years build off of that doesn't make it now constitutional. And then the other point was viability. And so that's the age at which the child can survive without the mother. But because that is a point in time that is not concrete, with technology increasing and medical technology increasing too, we're seeing that age become less and less, to the point now where babies have survived 21 weeks.
So let's just go back a little. How exactly did the prosecution, or I don't know which side is the pro-choice?
Yeah.
Jackson. How did they relate it, or how did they argue it for Plessy versus Ferguson exactly?
So they weren't arguing for Plessy versus Ferguson.
Or use it as an example.
Well, it was more the justices bringing that up as a point of saying, we've overturned cases in the past, which, granted, they haven't overturned as many just because they do try to hold to precedent. But this is, as at least the pro-life side was arguing, this is a rare case where precedent should be overturned because the original decision was wrong. And so they were kind of relating that to, I mean, the logical tie is to something like Plessy versus Ferguson with like a human rights issue, and something that, especially because that is one that is fully acknowledged on both sides. Like, yes, it should have been overturned. Just because the original decision was wrong and it was made, the Supreme Court decided that originally doesn't mean it should be therefore law. And that is a heart of the matter here is Roe and is Casey also settled law? The left and the pro-choicers argue yes, and then pro-lifers argue no.
Yeah, you definitely see that disagreement of arguing if it's actual law or not, because we look at how pro-choice look at the Texas bill, and they're just very upset and agreed that this bill went through and that the Supreme Court did not strike it down, or at least put it in a period of stay, I think. And so when we look at this, we kind of view this, we're like, okay, back in either Casey versus Planned Parenthood or Roe v. Wade, there was a mishap. And even I know Justice Clarence Thomas always talks about how both of those trials he thinks was mishandled and not really firm constitutionality in the rulings. And so that's why it just keeps on coming up again. But when the left is constantly saying, no, this is law, this is sound, and they kind of preach that in the media, and that's their kind of theme, is that, okay, we're going to say it's one thing, because not a lot of people are going to at least look into it, or if they do, they're going to be kind of listening with a different kind of ear. And so more and more, I think, like, if we can just get some story out and kind of show the pro-life argument from a case base or a constitutional base, instead of the, okay, we believe that these babies should be protected because of X, Y, and Z. Like, that's an argument that's needed, but also let's kind of like get the intellectual argument in with the lawyers and the legal aspect of it.
Yeah, and something else that I thought was interesting is there were three solid liberal justices in the court. There's one who's a little bit both. He's considered a conservative, but Justice Roberts isn't always the most solid. But so Justice Stephen Breyer and Sonia Sotomayor, they were kind of both asking questions about, it seemed like they didn't want to overturn Roe and Casey because they didn't want to seem political and look like they're responding to the political whims of the moment. And they were saying, well, now your argument has to be that much better because we cannot, as an institution, look like we are swayed by the politics of the situation.
Did they state that? Or you're like kind of like
no, I mean
verbatim.
Basically that was it. They're like, I think Breyer exactly said, I mean, this is not a quote, but he said, we should be much more hesitant to overturn it because we don't want to look like we are responding politically. Which I understand you don't want to look like as much of a political institution, but the nature of the debate itself is either way you rule, it's going to be political.
Absolutely, or whatever way they rule, the media is going to spin it how they want to.
Exactly.
It's funny, you will never see that kind of headline or those printed out on the front paper, his words right there that, okay, because constantly it's like, okay, the court's already politicized, we need to change it. That's why, like, either Biden's constantly asked about court packing or Pelosi's asked about it. And so the narrative coming out of this could be really interesting for the political dichotomy, I think, of our government after this.
Yeah.
Whether the left kind of pushes for reconstruction or reform, and then how the
You're good.
I'm struggling with a little congestion, but how the right kind of controls that pushback from the left after this case.
Yeah,
we won't have the verdict until maybe like late spring, or they're thinking, or June
summer,
is the end of the session.
I believe so. So it's going to be months till we have an answer. But I know even David French, who, whether or not you agree with him on many things, he's a good legal mind. And when he was here, I asked him about the different possibilities of the outcome of this Dobbs case. And even listening to the oral arguments, what the justices were asking, it sounded pretty clear of what the three possibilities would be. So I wrote those down. I think number one possible outcome is they basically overturn Roe, leave it to the states and the people respectively. I think that was what Kavanaugh, or maybe it was Gorsuch, they were very much hinting at that, saying it's not a right outlined in the Constitution. You know, it came out of thin air, this right to privacy that is also not in the Constitution, but just based off of their indication of autonomy in the 14th Amendment substantive due process clause. But so one is leave it to the states. Number two, they could rule in favor of Jackson and solidify Roe and Casey's viability standard. And I think that would be very discouraging. I don't think that will happen. That will be a complete win for the pro-choicers.
Even if that did happen, it leaves the door open to some restrictions, because the Casey and Planned Parenthood opened the door to restrictions. So at least,
well, if they rule in favor of it, though, of them, they just solidify Casey and Roe. So that doesn't really leave much room for anything. That's the status quo.
Well, so when I was listening, there's two different things I was listening to from the pro-choice kind of argument, and like even with, especially they're talking about how Casey versus Planned Parenthood is the bigger case.
Does it establish the age of viability standard?
Yes, and at least it allowed states to have some restriction on abortion, so which they were upset about. Any pro-choice was upset about that they could restrict at all. So it'll be interesting, I think, if Jackson wins, that might take away the restrictions. But I don't know what they're thinking, or the restrictions would be held up, which is maybe the only pro in Jackson winning.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's no possibility in which Casey gets turned down, and like the justices were not hinting at taking away the viability standard into something even better for the pro-choicers. It would either be taking away viability as in just having this is like the third option is end the viability standard and replace it with a new cutoff, which would even be better for the pro-lifers. Let's say it was like 15 weeks. Because I think Justice Roberts, he was saying, well, there's not a huge jump from 15 weeks in the viability standard. So what's your argument there? How is one an undue burden? And so the other option is that they just have this undue burden standard, which is a little more complicated. It's a lot of like legal jargon, and I don't even fully understand it. But I think worst case scenario is the status quo for us. I really don't think it's possible that anything worse than what it is now. It really can only be better, and unless it's the status quo. And I think even David French was saying he thinks that either Roe will be overturned or they'll have a lesser standard, or lesser in the sense of like less weeks, so more lives saved.
Yeah. Well, I know Catherine Colbert, the lawyer, was very pessimistic about any chance that pro-choice kind of comes out with a win, and they're like completely switching kind of their viewpoint of how to handle the situation and how to influence politics to where they want their pro-choice agenda kind of pushed out into the government, which she was arguing that's abandoned the courts. The courts are already going to kind of overturn this, and now we need to focus on the states. And so she's talking about, so currently there's 22 states with trigger laws to make abortion illegal in their states. So if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, those laws are already kind of in session. Yes, and they'll get voted on. And then 27 total, though, majority of states will kind of move to outlaw abortion, or at least restrict it to a really maybe a minimal week standard. And so they're very upset about that. But then pushing and moving the pro-choice agenda to, okay, how do we influence politics in our local community? And so that would be really interesting. Low-key scary, but...
Yeah, because I know we always talk about how we as conservatives need to look at the local level and the state level to influence our politics. And that's a great thing, but it's not a great thing if the left is... Because they're really good at messaging, and if they make it known that, hey, this is our next battle is here in the States, they're going to do it well. And so conservatives need to be ready to be on the offense and not always on the defense in their states and at their local level. So hopefully we can also see that the fight, assuming if something happens here good for the pro-life movement, the fight is at the states. And it never should have been it should never been at the Supreme Court anyways. They legislated from the bench in Roe and Casey. And since it's not in the Constitution, it should have been 9th and 10th Amendment left to the states and the people. So
Clarence Thomas loves throwing that term around there, legislating from the bench, and he hates it.
Hey, Thomas is my favorite justice, I will say. Do you have a favorite justice, Aaron?
I think it might be Thomas, too.
There we go. Thomas is the most base justice, for sure. Well, do you have anything else you want to kind of add to this? I know we could keep talking about Dobbs versus Jackson for probably hours, but we do have 2 more wins to get to.
I definitely think this whole situation of, at least with the judicial, it's more beneficial to pro-lifers right now. And then when we look at we're looking into the future and how states are going to play this out, it's going to be a constant give and take if Roe does get overturned. And I think it's going to kind of mirror politics, where it's just a constant up and down between okay, the left has control and these laws get passed. So it's a lot of just conjecture and hypothesizing what's going to happen. Yeah, or hypotheticals.
That's true. But hopefully the conservatives seem confident. So we just have to still hope and pray to save the babies, honestly. So next win is CNN fired Chris Cuomo. So this was happening, I think, Tuesday of this week. They released a statement saying he was indefinitely fired until They were going to do maybe some more investigation and see kind of what all happened. But as of now, and that is one of I think it's their top watched show.
Yeah, it's their most viewed show.
So they definitely took a hit with that. But I think this is a win because it's holding power to account because he was helping his brother. More came out that apparently they weren't privy to before, that he did have a greater level of involvement in Governor Andrew Cuomo's sexual harassment and covering that up and offering him advice into his aides than they originally thought.
And we have CNN, one of the most, at least.
Considered a leftist network, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, or at least considered by conservatives to be kind of too far gone, to come back and be like, okay, no, we're going to hold everybody to the same accountability, but they'd rather kind of sway with their opinion and switch what the rules they kind of enforce to who. So to see them taking their number one viewer or host and putting him on the spot and be like, okay, you messed up for working with Biden.
Dr. Z has a correction. He was suspended, not fired.
Oh. Okay. We just got word from Dr. Z. Mistake on my part. Chris Cuomo was suspended, not fired. So that is my fault.
Well, they're still looking into it. So
he's taken off the air as of now.
Because the headline I read and a couple of stories was that 18 months he was working with President Biden. But he was working with King Cuomo.
Yeah, King Cuomo.
And so in those months, he's helping him during the whole time when Cuomo's getting kind of criticized for his handling of COVID in New York, and especially with the sexual allegations coming out. And so we see the left holding brother Cuomo, accountable for at least helping or having a hand in it somehow.
Yeah, I also think it's kind of funny, though, the fact that this even constitutes a win just shows us what a low bar we have. Because... like,
I was thinking that too.
This really isn't like anything that like, wow, this is a huge win. They're like really holding power to account. But it's just, we do see them as so far gone that this is like, oh, wait,
exactly.
They're actually holding someone, they're not letting him keep on going while he helped his brother get away with sexual misconduct as the governor of New York. That's good. It just shows us kind of how low our standards really are, because that's what we've come to expect from them. Because I still don't think we should be giving them too much credit in this and saying like, wow, CNN's really turned a corner. We can trust everything they say now.
Yeah, definitely not in that kind of sense, but at least it's like a crumble of optimism to be like, okay, maybe we could come to an agreement with these.
Yeah, exactly.
Or maybe we could reform these news channels and change how they operate.
At least like some level of some integrity left in that decision, but who knows? I guess since he was just suspended, he could be back on air when they find out more what happened. So
yeah, that's definitely interesting. He got suspended. So if it was fired, I was gonna like conjecture, put out there that I don't know, maybe there's some more dirt to come out, and we'll see what happens kind of over the next couple of months as journalists kind of investigating that. But suspended, so we won't.
Yeah, suspended, and I'm sure they'll try to like
theories.
let this kind of go for a little bit, so it's not one after another. They'll let it go, and then it'll come back eventually, probably.
Yeah.
Who knows?
This kind of ties into the third topic. I don't know if we're premature in the topic, but Senator Hawley is calling out like Twitter for the recent rule changes, and then CEO Jack Dorsey stepped down. And so,
do we know why he stepped down? Did he give a statement?
I think he said personal reasons, and he's too involved, and you feel like he mishandled a lot of at least in the past like 2 years during COVID, he mishandled how misinformation was spread on the app, and so feels that someone else can do best. So Dorsey is kind of interesting because time and time again, whether he's on a podcast or a news channel, in my mind, he gives lip service to the idea that, okay, social media is a platform for free speech. And so when I mean he gives lip service, because when in practice over the past 2 years, we've seen constantly
what you say versus what you do.
Yeah, so it's not as much as a public square with there's no restrictions on what people are saying. Like when we look at the Hunter Biden story, that story was the New York Times,
suppressed,
reputable, put it up, and even the link was taken down. You couldn't put the link up for any reason because it was considered spammy. Yeah,
and here's the thing. In this argument, the big tech and the free speech arguments kind of go together, whether we're viewing this as a public platform with free speech or a private company. We've always had standards for free speech. You've never been able to say everything you wanted. And that's, I'm currently reading Michael Knowles' speech list, so he talks a lot about this. But we've always had limits on speech. But the thing is that we're seeing is limits put on mostly conservatives, and it's very ideologically driven in what they're defining as free speech versus hate speech, and misinformation and all of that is very one-sided.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, I agree with you on that point, but I kind of I don't know, I'm eerie to that because, yeah, we've always kind of limited speech, but it's been very specific. Is it a call to action that is dangerous, like calling a fire in a movie theater? Is it hate speech that is going to incite violence, in a school or something? And so, in the large majority, we have not seen that on these platforms.
Oh, yeah, I'm agreeing with that. I just mean, to kind of rebut the free speech absolutist argument, and where it's just you can say anything you want.
Yeah.
No, we have had limits on speech in the sense of obscenities or yelling fire in a crowded theater. But it's just understanding where those limits lie, and the limits are not being enforced correctly.
Yeah, I just think we have to be careful about, especially if we're conservative saying, okay, yeah, we do limit free speech. And then I swear I could just hear any progressive in my ear going, okay, yeah, we agree. We can definitely limit free speech. So now let's set out what that is. And if we have to come to some agreement, then
there's no agreement.
I think it's going to be too limiting. Yeah. So it's like a hill to die on or a sword to fall on is this free speech. And if Senator Hawley is making moves in the Senate to kind of put any legislation that would maybe limit or pass a legislation that would reform Section 230 on big tech and kind of limit their power, I would, over the next couple of months or years, I'd very happily see that. Yeah.
Well, I think I also saw Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio. He was saying how if what we see is expected with the 2022 midterms, and that we see hopefully, or not hopefully, but if we see what we think where many conservatives will get in, I think they said they will look at Section 230 reforms, or that will be one of their first things on their agenda to reform is these social media companies, especially because this is a big issue for conservatives. Conservatives are disproportionately getting the brunt of this.
Yeah. See, I hope that some people wouldn't even disagree with that. Middle of the road people, I think, always can see it, that the media skews against conservatives. And so when we think of social media as our active public square in America, and it has become our active public square. It's not even it could act as that. Majority of Americans interact, whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, on their phones, interacting on social media platforms. And so if that has become the public square in America, we have to protect the free speech that the Constitution inscribes. So especially when the new CEO is coming in, and her name is, I'm going to butcher, Parag Agrawal. I don't even know.
You're I'm
it's
not
a lot
gonna
of G's
try that.
and a W and a lot of A's. So she's coming in, and she's had some sketchy comments about how their purpose of Twitter is not to serve the First Amendment, and they're not bound by the Constitution. She, quote for quote, I'll pull it up. She said, our role is not to be bound by the First Amendment. In fact, Twitter's role in censorship is we serve a healthy public conversation and our moves are reflective of things we believe to lead to a healthier public conversation. So we have a
healthy public conversation. Who defines what that is? Take a minute. You're good.
We have a private corporation deciding what makes a healthy public conversation in America. For history, but no, the people decide. They can go back and forth. Factions can argue. And so it's just really concerning seeing either a new CEO coming in, but then it's helpful seeing Senator Hawley and that movement that you said, at midterms, that they'll reform. So that's at least optimistic.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll definitely be interesting to see what happens. It is concerning that this healthy public conversation is determined by those who are in charge. But the argument that we see a lot with big tech is that it's a free market because this is a private company, so the government shouldn't have the right to force these regulations on them and how they're running their company, and so how they're censoring speech or allowing speech on their platform. Again, I think we get really caught up in that free market argument as conservatives and seeing that as that is the highest good, is a free market. But if a free market is not if it is not producing human prosperity and human flourishing, I mean, it depends on if you see it as a means or an end. And I think many of us maybe with the libertarian bend, see it as an end in itself rather than a means to human flourishing. So I know Rachel Bavard is really solid on this topic. So if you are interested in learning more of that perspective, reading some of her op-eds would be a really great place to start. Okay, we also just got word from producer Dr. Z that the new CEO is a male, not a female, as we said she before. So correcting our pronouns there. Sorry, we have a lot of corrections today on the show. This is the first time, but I guess you're getting the more real look at the mistakes we make here in the underground
O'Connor
studio.
Said podcasts are rehearsed, and we try not to be rehearsed.
Yeah, this
for
is
your
more
benefit
natural
or
flow.
harm.
Exactly. Well, do you have anything else, Aaron, you want to mention on? I kind of said all my comments on Section 230.
No, I think we can wrap it up. So coming up, we have Christmas break coming up, and then we will be releasing kind of episodes over the break.
Mm-hmm.
I know next week we're not gonna have a regular podcast
That's
episode.
That's our study day.
Yes, our study day and free donuts at the SAC if you are at Grove City College.
If you're a GCC student, we have Orem's Donuts from 9 to 12 in the SAC. Come get your free donut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you so much for listening to these interesting topics, and definitely we'll be kind of staying on the arguments of Dobbs versus Jackson and what kind of evolves out of that over the next semester, actually.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. So thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube if you're listening, or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're watching or listening to the podcast. Share it with your friends. And if you're watching on YouTube, also hit the bell to be notified whenever we release more videos. So thanks so much, and we'll see you all soon.
For more information on this podcast or other programs, please visit faithandfreedom.com.